Hello, my name is Christina Labour and I'm from Germany.
Hi, my name is Sai Batula. I'm 14 years old, and I am from Mason, Ohio, in the United States of America.
Hi everyone, this is Julia Zhu from Beijing, China.
Yeah. This is Maria Rivera, and I am from Washington, D.C.
Hi, this is Kamsi from Saudi Arabia.
Hello, my name is Chloe Furman, and I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, in the US.
And we're Team Marshall and we're here to talk about bulimia nervosa.
Our question for this project was about bulimia nervosa and alcohol addiction. Do simple carbohydrates, heavily processed sugars, activate neural network pathways in the brains of people with bulimia nervosa analogously to people with alcohol addiction? Let me rephrase a little bit. So, simple carbohydrates, aka processed sugars, and we're looking at how simple carbohydrates affect the neural network pathways of bulimic patients' brains and comparing that to people with alcohol addiction and how alcohol affects an alcoholic's brain. So we're looking at the relation and seeing if there's any ties at all. We'll go over this a lot more specifically later on in the presentation.
Firstly, let us talk about our background research, where we looked into bulimia nervosa and addiction. Every hour, about one person dies as a direct result of an eating disorder, and only less than half of the affected will receive treatment. This is why this research and finding analogies between alcohol addiction and bulimia nervosa is so important to help treat it. Looking into simple carbohydrates, we found that these sugars result in an immediate burst of energy, which is quickly followed by a low. These carbohydrates tend to also encourage craving attacks, which can lead to binging in patients that suffer from bulimia nervosa. A study conducted by Turner et al. Found that more of the neurotransmitter tryptophan is in the brain after the intake of complex carbohydrates, which is the food that patients tend to avoid, even if it decreases binging. Moving on to aforementioned neurotransmitters, there are three we looked at that have an immediate connection to bulimia nervosa. There's tryptophan, which is an amino acid that builds serotonin. When serotonin exists, people have an increased satiety. In people suffering from bulimia nervosa, however, it has been found that serotonin and dopamine transporters have been reduced. Lastly, dopamine is responsible for pleasure and reward. A study has shown that binge eating releases dopamine. We also looked at the reward system, which is shown to have an imbalance when a person is bulimic. The rewarding system shows to be less robust and it reacts stronger to dopamine.
What is known? Drug addictions. A drug addiction is a chronic disease characterized by drug seeking and use that is compulsive or difficult to control, despite the harmful consequences. Most drugs affect the human brain's reward circuit, causing euphoria, as well as the flooding of the neurotransmitter dopamine. Over time, as a person continues to take these drugs, they become more tolerant towards them. They continue to take these drugs to achieve the same high that they once felt when they first began taking them. This cycle is similar to that of binging and purging. The binges are often when people feel out of control. Most bulimics are unaware of how much they are really eating, but when they do realize, they feel uncomfortable, so they purge. After they purge, they feel a sense of calm and experience a physical high. They promise themselves that they won't binge again, but they're unable to keep this promise, and so the cycle continues. Alcoholism and neurotransmitters. Drugs can either mimic or send lots of dopamine throughout the brain, which results from the brain believing that it is the best resource for dopamine due to its high amount of neurotransmitters. Neurological pathways affected by alcohol consumption include dopamine and serotonin. This draws similarities between the neurotransmitters involved in bulimia nervosa. The role of the reward system in addiction. So, the basal ganglia is an area affected by addiction. It is a key node of the brain's reward circuit. The basal ganglia plays an important role in positive forms of motivation. This includes pleasurable activities like socializing and eating. Drugs overactivate the reward circuit of the brain, which produces euphoria. The reward system adapts to this feeling and will not be able to feel the pleasure without the drug. This is also why overdosing happens. Because of the reward system, the drug people need higher drugs to feel rewarded. What is unknown? So after our research, there are still a few questions that remain unanswered. The first one is, could simple carbohydrates be seen as a drug people with bulimia get high on? And what happens in their brain? And is what happens in their brain similar to that of an alcoholic getting drunk? Secondly, can a better diet be the sole treatment, or is it binging and purging an addiction on its own? And how should this be treated? And our last question is, how does the effect of simple carbohydrates in bulimic patients differ from patients with no history of bulimia?
Let's move on to hypothesizing and our main hypothesis. So, coming to our main question, do simple carbohydrates, heavily processed sugars, activate neural network pathways, especially dopaminergic, serotonergic, and glutamate pathways in the brains of people with bulimia nervosa analogously to people with alcohol addiction? So before moving on to our hypothesis, let's talk a little bit about research. Our main finding that led to this question was one of our group's members found that carbohydrates are actually known to increase serotonin levels. And we know that serotonin is something that increases happiness and increases euphoria in a way. And serotonin, technically, when a person actually ingests alcohol, specifically an alcoholic person, the brain creates, after a series of processes, the brain results and has the neural network pathways activity are increased drastically. And this is proved by fMRI scans, etc., that we have in our sources. So when we did this research, we found that serotonin levels were higher. So when we saw that simple carbohydrates caused a higher level of serotonin, and we related it to how alcohol addiction works. So let's move to our hypothesis. We hypothesized that analogous to the effects of alcohol to an alcoholic person, the effects of a high dose of simple carbohydrates will do two things to a bulimic person. First of all, it will increase the circuitry and network pathway activity of the dopaminergic and serotonergic and glutamate pathways of the reward system located in the brain. And this will provide a very temporary feeling of euphoria. So think about when a person gets drunk. They experience a lot of happiness and the feeling of a buzz in a way for only a few minutes though. However, once that feeling is gone, well, the feeling is gone. You're not drunk forever. You have to drink alcohol or something again in order to get that effect. And this is where addiction comes in. So alcohol addiction, an alcohol addict, alcoholic. So these people have to keep on drinking alcohol over and over to get that, buzz that's called. Yeah. So this relates to bulimia nervosa. We thought because if simple carbohydrates cause higher amounts of serotonin in the brain, this will cause higher amounts of happiness. So, and we know how bulimia works. It's a series of binging and purging. So, when we see that this binging, we might see that maybe this is what happens. When a person with bulimia ingests a lot of carbs, simple carbohydrates, they feel that, state of, yeah, I need it. Yeah, it's really the feeling, right? And when that feeling is gone, they have to take it over and it actually acts like a drug. And so this was really intriguing to us, and we kind of compared it to alcohol addiction. So let's move on to our next question and see if we can elaborate on it. So we're trying to see if simple carbohydrates are basically a drug. So, what diet would be best for someone recovery from bulimia? We hypothesize a diet consisting of complex carbohydrates is ideal for a person suffering from bulimia nervosa, because the intake of this kind of carbohydrate really results in a rise in tryptophan, which in turn heightens the level of serotonin, which in turn again results in satiety. A person will no longer want to eat anymore; they're completely full. However, simple carbohydrates, though they result in a feeling of the rising tryptophan and serotonin, they are much more likely to provide a crash of fatigue, where the person needs that effect again. A person is not likely to feel full. So when you eat a lot of Oreos, a lot of sugar, a lot of raw sugar, you get that spike and then it's gone. It's like caffeine in a way, if you think about it that way. So we compared it to drug usage, and we thought this was perfect. And then, does eating too many carbohydrates have an impact on our mood and self-control? Well, logically, coming back to our question, if carbohydrates do activate the dopaminergic and serotonergic neural pathways leading to the brain, overindulging simple carbohydrates could and will indefinitely produce a side effect of short-term euphoria. However, after that grace period, the person will become depressed and the mood will change drastically. They'll have a lot less self-control. So now we'll move on to our next thing. But our main question was trying to answer is, can we compare alcohol addiction to bulimia nervosa and the effect of carbohydrates in bulimia nervosa?
Proposed methods. First, we would sample two groups. Both groups would contain 30 people. One group would contain people who are currently suffering from bulimia, and the other group would contain people who have no history of bulimia or eating disorders. The two groups would have to be as similar as possible in age, gender, and ethnic distribution. Both groups should contain college-age students. Using fMRI and SPECT, we would scan their brains to gather data about their neural circuits before the experiment. Other tests, such as a psychological profile and a very simple reaction test, would also be useful. We would feed both groups about a package of Oreos, so about 6 Oreos. Oreo cookies are high in sugar and also palatable to humans, so they can eat them without getting grossed out. We would give both groups about 5 minutes to finish their Oreos, and after waiting about 5 minutes, the post-test would begin. This process would be repeated once after a week. We are not trying to change diet, but simply see if including a much larger amount of simple carbs would have any effects. After 5 minutes is up, we would use the fMRI and SPECT scans to see which circuits of the brain were activated by the Oreo cookies. The neural networks and pathways that would be tested during this time include dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glutamate, etc. We would then chart the data and do a series of post-tests to see any physical or mental changes in the brain that we can see from an exterior perspective. Once the study is complete, preliminary data and post-Oreo cookie data would be compared between the groups of people with bulimia and the group of people with no history of bulimia. In other words, any differences at all would be noted, and the expectation is that the neural activity will be different. The data from this study will then be compared to previous studies done on alcohol addiction. This will then be used to see the relationship between alcohol addiction and bulimia. In previous studies done on both rats and humans, the results have shown that a consumption of sugar-rich foods or drinks primes the release of euphoric endorphins and dopamine within the nucleus accumbens. In this manner, this is similar to drug addiction. The neurobiological pathways of drugs and sugar addiction involve similar neural receptors, neurotransmitters, and hedonic regions in the brain. This also appeared to have some common genetic markers between alcohol dependence, bulimia, and obesity, such as the A1 allele gene and the dopamine 2 receptor gene. And here is the diagram. We would have the two groups. They would have the fMRI and SPECT scans before the food just to see what their normal activity is, feed them the Oreos, and then after 23 minutes, we would use fMRI and SPECT scans again to see which circuits were activated, and we would compare results between the two groups, and we would also take the data from this study and compare them to other previous studies done in alcohol addiction. This will test the relationship between alcohol addiction and bulimia.
The analytical considerations. Now let's take a look of limitations that occur in our experiment. The first one is possible set effect and time constraints associated with multiple use of fMRI and SPECT. In our experiment, we will use multiple times of fMRI and SPECT test, and waiting for the results may cause some experimental errors. The second one is our experiment only provides us with data including minor changes in neural network and dopaminergic activity. Granted, we will be able to use this to compare the relation mentioned earlier. However, we don't know how accurate it is going to be, and we don't have enough data to build a very strong correlation. The third one is small sample size may lead to bias in the results. The number of samples selected in our experiment is relatively small. This may affect the final result. Other factors in the experiment, such as participants' mood swings, may affect the brain during the experiment and results. This is our main concern because we want to see a very accurate results, and differences in every human's brain, other factors in human's brain may cause a lot of outliers. Diet outside of the experiment may affect the scans in a very minor way. So what people eat in addition, besides what they eat during the study, has an impact on the results. Arguments refuting results. Our experiment tries to control the variables, which is a relatively ideal experimental method, but there are other things going on in the brain that can influence our results. We want to look at changes in the brain before and after eating simple sugars, but we couldn't confirm whether other factors such as mood changes would affect what we want to see. The second point is that when selecting the sample population, it is not possible to exclude and determine whether there are potential binge eating disorder patients or other potential patients in the reference group. So the sample may be selected in the potential population of binge eating disorder. This may also cause a certain effect on our experimental results. Thirdly, there are certain differences in the degree to which each person absorbs sugar and tolerates sugar, so it is impossible to control the variable completely.
Ethical, legal, and social implications. When a patient suffers from severe bulimia nervosa and is refusing treatment, the clinician is now in a predicament. They can either request a forced treatment or respect the patient's wishes. However, this becomes more complicated when the patient is a child, because now not only is the clinician going against what the patient wants, but also what the parent has consented and has not consented to. Additionally, if a child is extremely sick or has been in the hospital frequently because, for example, they have cancer and they had to have multiple rounds of chemotherapy, this can now arise a risk for other mental health conditions, which is putting their physical health also at risk. And in this case, the clinician's concern for physical health can override the patient's and the parent's wishes. However, this brings the question of, is it really saving a life if it's against their will, or is it just following a for your own good mindset? Even though eating disorders have a high mortality rate, one of the highest of mental disorders, the government's attempts have been very minimal to tackle this issue. They have tried to sponsor anti-dieting campaigns and ban extremely thin models on public advertisement. However, these attempts are under advertisement and have yet to show real change, and professionals have yet to also bring their all to this epidemic. Following another big legal point is misdiagnosis and follow-up and wrong treatment. For example, Shira Rosenblatt has suffered with anorexia for over 2 decades because when she confronted her therapist about it, she stated that Shira was fine because she didn't have a anorexic's ideal body. This brought multiple issues for Shira. She lost trust in the medical community, and her family, and even herself. And of course, this brought on health problems such as electrolyte imbalances, heart attacks, esophageal tears, ulcers, and acid reflux, which she did suffer from. Culture plays a more substantial part than we originally thought of. For example, even though some disorders may have the same title or translate similarly, they don't quite mean the same thing. For example, ataques de nervios in Puerto Rico and panic attacks in the United States translate similarly, but they aren't quite the same thing because of different belief systems and what we think of human interactions, self-interactions, and how we deal what falls under that. Multiple factors come into that. Also, the media's modernizing of Western culture has been changing ideals constantly and beauty standards, which can explain why Western culture and the epidemic of eating disorders is far greater than in developing societies. Additionally, when we think about a bulimic or anorexic person, what comes to mind is a Caucasian woman. However, they can also be men. In a study, they found that people think that less than 1 in 10 men are bulimic or anorexic. In reality, 1 in 4 men are bulimic and slash anorexic. This also interferes with database. Men account for less than 1% of eating disorder related database, and this brings the problem of if they have symptoms or behaviors of eating disorders such as anorexia and bulimia, they don't know how to deal with it or seek professional help. With that said, thank you for your attention and time. From Team Marshall.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye from Saudi Arabia.
Neuroscientists, thank you so much for listening to us today.
This is Chloe Furman from the US saying goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye from Beijing.
Goodbye from Washington, D.C.